For near 100 years, there has been a stereotypical and perhaps rather reductive view of Japan as living in the future, or at least a world closer to it than the one us Europeans and Americans live in. Pictures of pearly white Honda-created robots and the country's near nationwide early adoption of smartphone technology probably didn't help the near cyberpunk image of Japan that existed and still exists in many Westerners' minds. For obvious reasons, I like to stay away from such sensationalist angles within my writing. Though, the game we're discussing today forces me to flirt with Japan's technological forwardness and the implications thereof. The topic of today's video may just be the genesis point for one of the most discussed issues of pop psychology in our modern Western world. And it all starts with a pop star that you've never heard of. This is Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School, or Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School. The concept of celebrity is one that transcends borders in our modern day, though what is expected of celebrities and entertainers may vary in different parts of the world. One of the most obvious examples of this to us Westerners is Japan's idol culture. A product of Japan's post-war economic boom and the growing access to television in the 1960s, Japanese idol culture is far more hierarchically structured than the American entertainment industry, and took what can only be described as a holistic approach to an entertainer's career and the contracts that accompany. Young talents were selected through audition processes and made to sign away the rights to any future output. Music, acting, merchandise, lots of merchandise. The oversaturation of these idols with tightly controlled images based on stereotypes and nostalgia led to a fan culture more rabid than anyone in the world had seen up until that point. As we are all well aware of now in our social media age, such devotion in a fan base can only lead to one thing developing between artist and fan: a parasocial relationship. This dynamic should be more than familiar to anyone who spends time online consuming user-made content. When a fan of a streamer, influencer, content creator, or even a more mainstream celebrity feel as though they, in some way, know the person they are a fan of, nowadays it isn't seen as too odd. Though, before the advent of platforms such as Twitch and YouTube, it was a far less mainstream idea. It was first observed by sociologists in the 1950s when studying the contemporary wave of American celebrity, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe and the like. After that, however, its relevance in the West remained rather niche up until the 2010s. Though, if you ask me, the idea was kept alive and first truly exploited for capital by the leaders of Japan's idol industry, which, to back myself up, isn't really too much of a stretch when you take into account how much the rise of Elvis and rock and roll in America was an influence on early post-war Japanese pop music. All throughout the 70s and 80s, idols in Japan were engineered to meet every possible standard for a woman, and would each inhabit different looks, sounds and aesthetics as to appeal to the widest market possible. The multi-hyphenate nature of idol artists also fed into the fostering of parasocial relationships, as fans had multiple mediums to enjoy their favourite idol through, first with movie roles, then TV appearances, radio shows, magazines, and then, eventually, video games.
私と恋愛物語作らない？ファミコンゲーム中山美穂のときめきハイスクール。ゲームの途中で電話番号が出たら電話をかけて私のメッセージを聞いてね。美穂です。お電話ありがとう。ゲームの結果をディスクファックスすれば美穂の素敵なプレゼントが当たります。
Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School is an adventure game for the Famicom Disk System, a Japan-exclusive add-on for Nintendo's first console. The game was developed in the span of 2 weeks by the unlikely pairing of Squaresoft and Nintendo's lead development studio R&D1, with Square just days away from releasing their defining title Final Fantasy at Tokimeki High School's release. This experimental adventure game would quickly fade from public memory in Japan, with it never even making an impression over here in the West due to the fact it was never localized. To the people who mattered, however, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School would provide the template for a whole new genre of video games just a few years after its release. Though, I am getting ahead of myself. First things first, I must familiarise you with some names and faces for you to really understand the cultural weight of this early piece of multimedia advertising. Let us start with the most pressing of the names and faces. Miho Nakayama was a bona fide superstar in the 1980s Japanese idol scene. Starting her dual singing and acting careers in 1985 after being scouted off the streets of Tokyo, Nakayama quickly became one of the most famous people in Japan, and over the course of her career racked up 8 #1 singles in the country. By Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School's Christmas 1987 release, the idol's face and likeness had become such a marketing powerhouse that it only felt right to adapt that face into the burgeoning artistic medium of video games. The eventual makers of Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School would rather coincidentally go on to become some of the most famous names in the Japanese gaming industry. So, I guess we should cover them next. Gunpei Yokoi would produce this experimental new title for Nintendo, his name famous in the company and around the world for basically creating the Game Boy, and producing some of Nintendo's early mega hits such as Donkey Kong and the Mario Bros. The game would be directed by Yoshio Sakamoto, Nintendo employee and now famed director of Super Metroid. Along with directing, Sakamoto would share game design duties with another future video game making legend, Hironobu Sakaguchi. Days before Sakaguchi and Square's first so-called Final Fantasy, another quite different sort of fantasy was releasing with Sakaguchi's name attached. Our next name is another future Final Fantasy alumnus. Yes, Tokimeki High School's music was made by world-renowned composer Nobuo Uematsu. And if all those famous faces weren't enough, it's been said that even Shigesato Itoi, famous Japanese author and the creator of the Mother/Earthbound series, was informally asked for feedback and advice during the game's development. I bring up all of these now legendary people who worked on this title as to convince you of its importance when understanding the eventual dating simulator genre of video games, Japanese idol culture, and the rabid fandoms that come along with both. Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School today plays like your typical adventure game. Lots of examining environments and talking to characters multiple times to progress the story. Though, at the time of its release, genre conventions weren't so rigidly locked in, so labelling this unique title wasn't so cut and dry. If we want to get specific, in Japan upon release, Tokimeki High School would have been placed alongside Bishoujo Games, a genre of games centered around talking to pretty girls. I mean, the name literally means pretty girl games. Alongside these other titles, Miho Nakayama's contribution stood out due to its innocence. As many of you will have guessed by now, Bishoujo games of the time were focused on, let's call it, more erotic interactions with digital women. Of course, it would be just as strange today as it would have been back then for Nintendo of all companies to put their name on such smut, though the money it was raking in for companies less fussed about pics on nipples was too overwhelming to ignore. With Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School, it seems as though Nintendo was trying to extract the safer work core at the heart of Bishoujo games. that being their choose-your-own-adventure-like conversation mechanics, and translate them into a package with far broader appeal. With all that in mind, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School sees a self-insert player protagonist moving to a new high school after his father's job relocated their family. The protagonist, like many other students in his school, is a fan of pop idol Miho Nakayama. And by a rather suspiciously large coincidence, the player and protagonist quickly start to suspect that fellow classmate Mizuho is actually the idol in disguise. The gameplay of Tokimeki High School will see the player-protagonist duo engaging in conversations with Mizuho and other faces around the school, all in an attempt to get the supposed pop star to reveal herself. The conversation system within this early title does have some mechanical depth, with the player not only required to pick verbal answers in conversations, but also a corresponding emotion to go along with it. Normal, smiling, scowling, troubled, surprised and grinning each add different connotations to your answers. However, knowing which one to match with the often rather obtuse selection of verbal responses is where the game's challenge really lies. And it's an unforgiving challenge. The game has specific successful routes through conversations, and it will make you repeat entire interactions over and over until you trial and error your way into making Mizuho happy. A trial and error approach is basically required, as your only other option is to do what the game wants of you and attempt to read the changes in your conversation partner's face and watch their animations to try and pass out their mood. Though this is a lot easier said than done, as the graphical limitations of the Famicom Disk System require those hints to be incredibly subtle, and most of the time I barely noticed a change in the first place. There was a hint system in Tokimeki High School for those who just couldn't read them pixels, though trying to use it today is impossible. This is because to get the hints, a player had to physically pick up the phone and call the numbers that periodically appear on screen. And of course, those numbers are completely disconnected. There was also supposedly a recorded message from Miho Nakayama herself on one of these numbers, congratulating you on finishing the game. It's small presentational and even conceptual flourishes like that which make this proto-dating sim so fascinating to look at in the context of parasocial relationships. By having Nakayama herself basically talk to you on the real-life telephone, the developers and the idol's name's rights holders are outright stating that this product's goal is to simulate a relationship with an idealized person. If I were reviewing Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School, I would emphasize this aspect of my experience. My appreciation of this game's many bold new ideas for its time, whilst not actually enjoying my time with some of its more obtuse mechanics. Any astute members of our audience will have already realised, however, that in 2022, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School's historical significance does not lie in its merits as a game one plays, but instead it is remembered for its influence. Just 7 years after the 2-week period when Nintendo and Square would rather slapdashedly attempt to adapt early 80s pornographic PC adventure games into something more innocent and family-friendly, Tokimeki Memorial was released. Konami's blockbuster dating simulation that would basically kickstart the genre took more than just a name from the game we've been discussing today. Tokimeki Memorial is the fully ripened fruit of Miho Nakayama's metaphorical seed. It feels as though everything, from the high school setting to the reading of animations to gauge a conversation partner's mood, managed to find its way into Tokimeki Memorial, just in a beefed up, higher budget form. Now, I have already made a rather extensive video on the original Tokimeki Memorial and its history of Japanese exclusivity, so I'm not going to linger on the topic for too much longer. However, there was just one other aspect of Tokimeki Memorial clearly inspired by Tokimeki High School that I wanted to focus in on. It's no secret that the girls of Tokimeki Memorial are each based off of archetypal pop idols from 80s Japan, Miho Nakayama included. I mean, one of the more successful of the series' many spin-offs, Tokimeki Idol, literally makes the girls you interact with, well, idols. I think this basis in popular archetype is what made Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School and Tokimeki Memorial's girls so appealing to Japanese youth at their release. The Japanese idol industry had been attempting to foster feelings of familiarity between idol and fan all throughout the 70s and 80s. And with video games, they had found the perfect medium for solidifying those feelings of familiarity into something mirroring our modern day concept of parasocial relationships. Just like streamers, influencers and content creators present their audiences with a sanitized and heavily controlled version of themselves and the lives they lead, Square, Nintendo and eventually Konami perfectly program these digital idols to tap in to the most primal and social parts of our psyche. Before Twitter, Patreon or OnlyFans, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School lets you get a little bit closer to your favourite content creator. Thank you for watching till the end of this video, dear viewer. Now, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School was never released outside of Japan, so in research for this video I was playing the recently released English translation patch by FCC Translations. I am, of course, fascinated with the fan translation process and everything that goes along with it. So, for the end of this video, as a little bonus, I managed to secure an interview with FCC Translations themselves for your viewing pleasure. Before we start, however, I must just say that the voice that you will be hearing is not that of FCC Translations, as the interview was conducted through text and then I got a voice actor to read out the lines. I have left the Translations romhacking.net page down in the description if you would like to check it out for yourself. One last thing, please like this video and comment any thoughts you had down below. And also subscribe to the Any Button to Start channel as we are on the road to hitting 2,000 subscribers. And your help would be a real help. Anyway, on with the interview. So, where did you first hear about Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School? And what was the initial spark for your translation project?
I initially heard about the game from Filler's romhacking.net thread. Filler needed to have the next text inserted, so I decided to help him out. It originally started as a small favor, and well, it went from that to being a 5-year-long project.
Were there any particular difficulties in modding a Famicom Disk System game, seeing as it is quite an obscure console?
The Famicom Disk System is pretty infamous for being difficult to hack, so of course, the obvious choice was for my first translation project to be for it. Initially, the issue was fitting the entire script in. I initially made a shoddy custom script dumping an insertion utility and that was it. I didn't do any assembly hacking at the time. The whole timeline is in the patch's readme if you want to learn more on how I improved my skill set. One thing I want to note is that despite being an obscure add-on, I coded my own disk image creation and disk image file extraction utility based on fan-created documentation. While there's already other ones in the wild, they didn't fit my workflow and were closed source. If you understand the inner workings of the Famicom, then you already have a solid understanding of the Famicom Disk System. It's an add-on after all, and the key differences lie in the floppy disk. It's sort of like a puzzle. You have to strategize how big the file can be and where to place it in RAM. You can even move other files in its place. But certain files reference the RAM locations of other files, especially the assembly files and so on. Some games, like The Legend of Zelda, would require a total disassembly to be properly translated because of the way it's structured and programmed. This game was, admittedly, not so bad to work with in retrospect once I got the concepts down. For this project, I was able to expand most script files a fair amount as there was a lot of free RAM after them. I also relocated the dictionary to a larger unused RAM region and added more dictionary entries. Combined with improving the dictionary compression, in the end, The script was able to freely breathe without us having to consider space constraints later on. For my custom assembly hacks, I had a couple of tricks to fit them in despite harsh RAM limitations. I apparently optimized the dictionary compression so well that I had a lot of free space in the item text area, which is almost always loaded in memory. Therefore, I added a handful of custom code patches there. Additionally, I optimized the dictionary decompression code to insert a custom page break control code, further improving the compression. The menu hacks were a different beast. I had to recode menu assembly code and make my new code fit within the space limitations. Menu hacking for any console is going to be tedious. It's not anything console specific.
I see that you translated the game's manual. How important do you think including supplementary material like manuals is when creating a fan translation project?
It's very rare for fan translation projects to include a translated manual. I tend to push for a translated manual whenever I can, and I'm always the one doing the editing for it. I always consider it a nice bonus, and it makes it feel more like a new official release. You never know when a manual will contain useful game hints. For Tokimeki High School, the manual is fairly useless by today's standards, if not a little creepy. The phone flyer is far more useful as it contained game hints, so I'm really glad PPL Toast, a beta tester, managed to track it down online.
This project took 5 years to release. What stopped you from cancelling it?
I suppose I'm a little crazy for holding on to the project for this long and not canceling it. I'm sure the typical answer people are looking for is that I just love the game that much. While I do find parts charming, I've mentally moved on at this point. I think my favorite part of the game was escaping the mansion as it's the most puzzle-oriented and kind of surreal, but certain parts are a simple test of patience. Apparently, one translation project was canned because the team couldn't beat the game. Anyway, I think the main source of motivation was my attitude towards the project. I took it on as a challenge. Although, to be honest, after I returned to the project, hacking the menus and managing the project took up more time than it did to fit the text in. The bulk of the work to improve the compression took under a week.
Are dating sims more work to translate than other genres?
This game is more of an adventure game than a dating sim. Adventure games are fairly text-heavy, and as stated before, everything is loaded into RAM in this case, so the only options were compression and expanding the files within RAM limitations. Anyway, one other issue for adventure games is that options can be reused in different contexts. For a lot of projects, I play the game multiple times to make sure the script flows naturally. I make sure said lines make sense in multiple contexts. Worst case scenario, I have to insert a new line into the game and force the game to load that new one. I didn't have to resort to this method for this project.
And that's our interview. Thank you very, very much to FCC Translations for sitting down with me and answering my questions, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. Anyway, until next time.